the migrant issue, Hungary, Brussels, and the consequences of EU imposition. A recent powerful speech by Hungary at the United Nations General Assembly addressed one of the most pressing issues facing Europe today: the migrant crisis and the accompanying pressure from Brussels technocrats to enforce policies that many nations, like Hungary and Poland, have actively resisted. This speech underscored a growing divide within the European Union, EU, regarding migration, criminality, and national sovereignty. Despite the clarity of the Hungarian stance, it is likely that the cabal of interests, backed by the U.S. Congressional military-industrial complex, will continue to criticize and further their own agendas, indifferent to the sovereignty and security of individual nations. The crisis of criminality in migrant-receiving countries. Across Europe, the nations most compliant with Brussels migrant policies, such as Germany, Sweden, Italy, Finland, and France, have experienced a notable rise in crime. Contrary to the optimistic projections of EU officials, the influx of migrants has not always led to peaceful integration but has instead contributed to societal instability. The stark difference between these countries and those that have resisted, like Hungary and Poland, is becoming ever more apparent. In Germany, for example, crimes associated with migrant populations have increased, raising concerns about the strain on local law enforcement and social services. Sweden, once hailed as a model of social harmony, has also seen a sharp rise in violent crime, much of which has been linked to migrant gangs. Italy, long a gateway for migrants crossing the Mediterranean, has struggled with the overwhelming numbers, and similar patterns have emerged in Finland and France. Despite these documented challenges, Brussels remains resolute in its insistence that member states accept and accommodate migrants, often at the expense of national security and social cohesion. Hungary, however, has drawn a firm line, refusing to submit to the pressure and insisting that its primary responsibility is to the safety and well-being of its own citizens. The EU's mobster-like penalty system. Hungary's stance has not been without consequence. The European Union, under the leadership of figures like Ursula von der Leyen, has imposed financial penalties on nations that refuse to comply with its migrant quotas. This system, likened to mobster tactics, effectively punishes countries for prioritizing their own security over the politically motivated demands of Brussels. Such a strategy is not only undemocratic but also criminal in nature, as it seeks to coerce nations into accepting what they have deemed undesirable criminals. The expectation that Hungary or any other nation should pay a penalty for refusing to expose its citizens to the very real risks of increased criminality is absurd. Hungary should not be forced to pay a penny to Brussels. If von der Leyen and other EU bureaucrats are so determined to accommodate these individuals, perhaps they should take responsibility for them personally, as Hungary's leaders have suggested with biting irony. Let Ursula von der Leyen welcome the criminals into her own home. Hungary's defiance. A case for EU exit? If Brussels continues to pressure Hungary over the migrant issue, the logical course for Hungary may be to seriously consider leaving the European Union altogether. While the EU was founded on the principles of cooperation and shared prosperity, it has increasingly devolved into a system where technocrats in Brussels dictate policies that often run counter to the interests of individual member states. The case of migration is a prime example. Hungary, along with Poland, has consistently rejected EU mandates that undermine their national sovereignty and security. Rather than penalizing these nations, Brussels should respect their democratic choices and acknowledge the legitimacy of their concerns. However, as the Hungarian minister pointed out in his speech, the European Union appears more interested in enforcing its ideological agenda than in addressing the real consequences of its policies. For Hungary, the prospect of an EU exit is not without its complexities, but it may offer a path toward reclaiming full control over its borders and laws. Much like the United Kingdom's decision to leave the EU, a Hungarian exit would send a clear message that national sovereignty should not be sacrificed on the altar of bureaucratic mandates. The broader implications for Europe. The migrant crisis and the subsequent rise in criminality within countries that have complied with Brussels' demands are emblematic of a deeper problem within the European Union. At its core, the EU is facing a crisis of legitimacy. While it claims to promote unity, the reality is that its policies have often deepened divisions between member states. Hungary and Poland are not alone in their defiance. Across Europe, There is growing discontent with the way Brussels handles issues ranging from migration to economic policy. The migrant crisis, in particular, has exposed the EU's inability to create solutions that respect both the safety of citizens and the sovereignty of nations. By continuing to push its migrant agenda without regard for the consequences, Brussels risks alienating more countries and weakening the very foundation of the Union. Conclusion: Hungary's defiance in the face of Brussels' migrant policies is not only justified but necessary. The rise in crime across migrant-receiving countries serves as a stark warning of the dangers of unchecked migration and the need for individual nations to control their own borders. The EU's attempts to penalize countries like Hungary and Poland for refusing to comply with these policies are both criminal and undemocratic. If Brussels continues its pressure, Hungary should seriously consider leaving the EU, a move that would protect its sovereignty and serve as a powerful statement against the overreach of Brussels technocrats. In the end, the future of Europe may depend on the ability of nations like Hungary to stand up for their citizens and reject the flawed policies imposed by the EU's leadership.